From where we left off in the last tape, we were going over this man here, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson ran for president in 1824. Although he got the largest number of votes and the largest number of electors, he did not get a majority, so he did not become president. He ran as one of many candidates in that election who were appealing to the underlying divisions in the United States. You had a United States divided over slavery. You had a United States divided over rich and poor. You had a United States divided between factories and farmers. You had a United States divided between bankers and people who owed money. You had candidates who tried to take a side on one of those issues and win people over with it. And that is a plan that can oftentimes tear a country apart. You've seen civil wars started over less than that in other countries in the world. So anyway, Jackson appealed to the common man, to the poor working people, and working people got more votes, didn't win. He went around the country saying, I got robbed. And why he becomes important anyway is because of this man here. His name is Martin Van Buren. That is, you see this happen a lot. That is, somebody thinks they got cheated in an election, and oftentimes afterwards they become a subject of scorn and ridicule. Not Andrew Jackson, because Jackson met up with Van Buren. And let me give you the Martin Van Buren story. Martin Van Buren was from New York, which is right over here. He was part of the new generation of politicians. He was actually born after the American Revolution. That is, guys like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, whatever their real reasons were for getting into politics, they at least liked to tell themselves that they were in it because of their duty. That is, that they were here in order to save the world or something like that. Van Buren didn't give a rat's ass about any of that stuff. He went into politics because he wanted the job. Politics looked lucrative. Politics looked fun. Right? He was in it to win it. All he cared about was winning elections and staying in power. He got himself elected to the New York legislature, where he worked his way up the ranks because he was somebody who was a fixer. A fixer is somebody who's good at organizing people. That is, you put him in a small group of people, he'll talk to everybody, he'll find out what everybody wants, what all their strengths and weaknesses are, and use it against them in order to manipulate them to do what he wants. If you've ever taken an online class before, or you ever done a group project, your group project probably had a fixture like this. If it didn't, the group project didn't get done. Right? If you've ever been at a 4-year school, been a member of a fraternity, if you had a fixer, somebody remembered to buy beer for the party. If you did not, nothing happened. Okay? So Van Buren worked his way up through the ranks like that, and by the time you get to the 1820s, he dominated the New York legislature. He wanted to be more than that, though. He wanted to go all the way up to the top. He was very ambitious. He wanted to be president. He wanted to be governor. But he found he was stuck. The reason why he was stuck is because he looks like this. He was balding. He was short. And he was not particularly charismatic. If you put him in a room with about a dozen people, he would win them over. But if you put him in front of a stadium of 10,000 people, he would bore the hell out of them. Right? So because he lacked that kind of charisma, because he lacked the ability to reach out to common people, he had plateaued. He had gotten as far as he could in politics, couldn't go any further. He concluded, though, that he still had a way to get to the top. And that would be if he hooked himself up with somebody who had all the things that he didn't. Somebody who was charismatic, somebody who did have a touch with the common people. If Van Buren figured if he could make that person get all the way to the top, that is, if he could make himself indispensable to that person, then that person could pull him up the rest of the way when he was done. Right? So Van Buren was thinking this when Andrew Jackson came to town. He sized Andrew Jackson up immediately. He saw that he was vain and narcissistic. But he also saw that the guy had talent. That is, that he was charismatic. Common people responded to him. So Van Buren saw an opportunity here. He went straight to Andrew Jackson and said, General Jackson, you were right. Not only were you robbed of the election, the people were robbed because they deserve your leadership. Andrew Jackson heard what he wanted to hear. He had a suck up around him, and he let him suck up to him more. And eventually, Jackson and Van Buren basically cut a deal. Jackson would run again in 1828, but this time Van Buren would be running things in order to make sure that he won. Right? So Van Buren looked to see what he could do in order to make Andrew Jackson president. This is, remember, how the election turned out. Jackson won the largest number of electoral votes, but he needed a couple of more states to get the majority. And there were two in particular that Van Buren was focusing on: New York and Virginia. New York, Van Buren figured he had covered because he was the most powerful politician in New York. He knew where all the bodies were buried. He figured he could get more electoral votes for Jackson from New York. So Van Buren was concentrating more on Virginia. Because you look at Virginia over here, Virginia went in the 1824 election to William Crawford. Crawford, remember, was the guy who had a stroke before the election. Right? So why would anybody support William Crawford? So Van Buren figured he would go to Virginia and find out what was going on. He found out that Virginia was dominated by a bunch of big tobacco farmers, big slave owners. And they dominated the party. They went with Crawford because he was the candidate of the party. So Van Buren asked them, what would it take to get those guys to support Andrew Jackson in the next election? They said, we will support Andrew Jackson if you make sure that slavery is never discussed in Congress again. Right? Remember, after the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, slave owners all over America wanted discussion over slavery silenced. They were able to do that in the states that they controlled. But they have all these states up here that they don't control. So they would need the cooperation of northern politicians in order to make sure that slavery would not be discussed. Right? So they told Van Buren, we'll make your boy Jackson president if you give us what we want. That is to make sure that there is no discussion over slavery. Van Buren said, cool, because Van Buren didn't care about slavery or any other issue. And in this case, although slavery was a divisive issue, by not talking about slavery, although you're giving one side what they want, you still aren't really attracting any attention. You're just keeping the status quo, keeping things the way that they are. So what you got as a result of this was a historic alliance between the Southern slave owners and New York politicians. And as a result of that alliance, they created a brand spanking new organization that would be very important in the United States in the future. It is called the Democratic Party. This, by the way, is the same Democratic Party that is around today. And it was created as a result of this alliance between Van Buren and the Virginia slave owners. And really, for the next 100 years, it would be dominated by kind of New York financiers and the politicians that they controlled, and the Southern elite, the Southern slave owners. And after slavery, the Southern white slave landowners who own most of the land. Right? It's ironic that that's the same political party that made the black guy president in 2008, Barack Obama. But the Democratic Party's constituency changed a lot over the last 90 years, particularly when a guy named Franklin Roosevelt becomes their leader in the 1930s. But we'll get to that in 1302. So Van Buren has now created this new national organization, the Democratic Party, to get Andrew Jackson elected president. Right? And he figures while he's at it, he will run guys for office for every election in the country. He will run guys for mayor. He will run guys for county commissioner. He will run guys for judge. He will run guys for Congress. He will run guys for governor. Right? So now he has to figure out how to get those people to win. One thing you could do is he could get politicians to go out there, find out what the issues are, and take stands on them. This is what your political science classes say how government should work. Martin Van Buren concluded very quickly that this was a stupid idea. He figured that the only thing that you got from taking a stand on issues was enemies. Right? Because after all, remember how many divisive issues there are in the United States. Right? If he takes a stand against slavery, then he's going to alienate all those people in the country that support slavery. If he takes a stand in favor of the poor, then he alienates the rich. If he takes a stand with the bankers against eliminating debts, then he alienates the debtors, so on and so forth. So Van Buren figured the safest number of issues to take a stand on was none. Right? That is, he was going to have the Democratic Party avoid every major divisive issue in the country. So if you're avoiding all the issues, then why should anybody vote Democratic? Van Buren's genius was he figured out a way to sell the party while still avoiding issues. How could he do it? Well, one thing he would do is he would sell the voters charismatic leaders like Andrew Jackson. He would tell the voters, you know Andrew Jackson, you like him. Make him president, he will do the right thing. We won't tell you what that is, but damn it, it's going to be the right thing. Right? That is, you sell the person, not the product. The person is the product, kind of. And if any of you ever worked retail, you know how well that would work. That is, if you ever worked retail, how important is it that the person you're selling to likes you? And how long does it take that person to figure out whether he likes you or not? Right? So Van Buren is going to sell politicians like potato chips. You identify with them and then you support them. So he's going to fill the Democratic Party full of charismatic individuals like Andrew Jackson. He then is going to put the party in Democratic Party. That is, the United States in 1828 was a very boring place. You did not have sports yet. You did not have TV. Netflix would not be invented for another 200 years. So, what he was going to do was make the Democratic Party a spectacle. As the United States in 1828, you had a lot of people who left settled areas and resettled again in new areas, in new states, in new towns. They didn't know anybody, they didn't know their neighbors. Right? They were distant from extended family. So what the Democratic Party did was it filled the gap. Van Buren would election time hold big rallies. He would get musicians and they would hold a big parade with a marching band. The parade would end at a big fairground where the party would give away free barbecue, free liquor. They would bring in charismatic pep rally speakers to go in there and entertain the public and sell the party. Right? So, in a country where there was really nothing to do, where there was really no place to take your family, where the only real public events were drinking and whoring, Van Buren was going to have the party fill the gap. And think about how that still works. Like, if any of you are political geeks, or any of you know any political geeks, you ever noticed how those political geeks treat their political party, whichever one they're for the way that normal people treat the Texans or the Rockets? And that is, they treated them as a team to be rooted for. And, and Van Buren is basically creating this type of image in a world where you don't have actual teams to root for yet. Why not root for these guys? So he is creating a sense of identity in the party name by doing things like parties, by having rallies, events. He is tying the elections to individuals. So you're buying the person, not the party, not the issue. And he's also going to give people a practical reason to vote. It's called the spoils system. And let's go over how this is going to work. Van Buren figured that the key to winning an election is organization. That is to have people go out into the countryside and get in people's faces. Remind them when the election is. Right? Remind them who the good guys are. Physically drag them to the polls as necessary. Right? And by the way, modern politicians think the same thing. They figure organization is the key to victory. Nowadays, to a certain extent, social media has become the organizer. For example, that's how Donald Trump won the elections in 2016. He was much more advanced in using things like Twitter and Facebook in order to be able to get his people together, to get people who like him to remember why they like him, to know about when the elections are in order to motivate them to vote. But before social media, you would have to have people go in there and do that face to face. So Van Buren would go into the cities. He would have his people go into the cities and try and into the countryside, try to get organizers together. If you're a prospective organizer, probably the first question you ask is, "What's in it for me?" Van Buren could say, "You vote for Andrew Jackson, he will save the world." At which point you would laugh at him because you know Jackson, Van Buren, all of those guys are avoiding all the major issues. So that out of the way, what Van Buren will do is give you a practical reason to support the party. And that practical reason is the government controls a lot of jobs. Right? It is, if you look at various levels of government, from local up to president, they control jobs ranging from dog catcher to Secretary of State. The United States, as of 1828, didn't have civil service yet. Right? So the executive of whatever government could hire and fire everybody. If a new mayor came in, he could fire all the city employees. If a new president came in, he could fire all the federal employees. So Van Buren told the prospective organizers, if you go out and you work for the party, you work 12 hours a day before the election, you physically drag people to the polls if necessary. If we win, we'll give you a government job. We'll make you dog catcher. We'll make you a policeman. We'll make you a school teacher. We'll make you Secretary of State, depending on how high up on the chain you were. Right? And you would only get that job if the party won the election, which meant that you had an incentive to work and to work hard. So Van Buren now had a motivated group of organizers who are going to go out into their communities, pressure people to vote for Jackson, pressure people to vote for the Democratic Party. If you're one of those people in the communities, you could ask, why should I vote? Right? Well, the organizer would remind you that you like Andrew Jackson or whatever charismatic figure they're shilling. They would remind you that you like going to their parties, you like going to their pep rallies, their barbecues, and the like. But if those don't work, they could give you a practical reason too. It will work like this. If you're in the United States in the 1820s, a lot of people need a lot of things. There is a huge demand for social services. And remember, those people are ruthless. They have left extended family behind. So a lot of them don't have family to take care of. They don't know anybody in their community. Right? So what happens to you if you get in trouble? Well, the party is going to fill the gap. Right? That is, they could go to a prospective voter and say, hey, I understand your brother-in-law is in trouble. He's in jail again. The party will get him a lawyer. By the way, we got an election coming up next week. Make sure you work for the right guy. Right? Understand you're having financial trouble. The party will get you a turkey on your table for Thanksgiving. By the way, we got an election coming up next week. Make sure you vote for the right guy. Right? So those people would be getting the services they need from the party. And in return, they would be expected to be loyal to the party and vote for the party. Right? And by the way, the party could make sure that they voted the right way because elections up until about 1900 or so in the United States weren't secret ballots. That is, you didn't go into a place with a booth and cast a vote like you do today. In 1828, in most places, the election was held in a public building where you had party organizers standing around. You would go to a party organizer and get a ballot from him. The county didn't print up their own ballots. The ballot you would get from the party organizer would have the list of all the offices that were running with the party candidate's name up beside it. If you wanted to vote for somebody else, you would have to take your pen out of your pocket, cross out the party guy's name, and write in the person you wanted to vote for out in public in front of everybody. And then you would drop your ballot into a can that would be in the middle of a room so everybody would know that you dropped it in. And the various political parties all made sure that they printed their ballots in different colors. So anybody standing in the room would know which ballot you got and which ballot you dropped. And, and if you altered it any. So the party would know if you crossed them. And if you ever double crossed them, they would never help you again. So the party is giving organizers practical incentives to go in and find out what the voters want. They are giving the voters practical incentives to vote for the party. And then how do you pay for all this stuff? Well, Van Buren's going to do that by controlling the government. He's going to leverage future control of the government in order to take control of the government. Okay, this is through something called graft. Right? And let's explain how it works. Say you own a construction company, and I am Martin Van Buren. Right? The state is going to be putting in a contract for a new freeway or a new toll road. It's going to stretch from Tomball up to College Station. You have calculated that your construction company could build this toll road for $8 million and turn a profit. So Martin Van Buren comes up to you and says, I can get you that contract for $10 million, as the government will pay you $10 million. Are you interested? You would say, hells yeah, because if the contract is profitable at 8, it's really profitable at 10. Here's the catch. Van Buren would tell you that as soon as you got the contract, you would have to kick back $1 million as a donation back to the party. If you're practically minded, you would do that because you're still getting paid $9 million for a contract you could make money at 8. Right? And what is Van Buren going to do with the $1 million? Well, he's going to put some of it in his pocket, but the rest of it's going to go to paying the party's expenses. That is, they got to pay for barbecues, they got to pay for bands, they got to give their organizers walking around money, they've got to come up with legal fees, turkeys for Thanksgiving for their voters. Right? So by taking those government contracts, they can, in fact, right, pay for the expenses of the party. If you put all that together, the jobs for the organizers, the services for the voters, the selling of the contracts in order to make money, in order to pay for the party, this is all called the spoil system. And if you use the spoil system, you can take control of the government without ever discussing a single issue. The Democratic Party rolled this out in 1828. How well did it work? Well, the incumbent president was a man named John Quincy Adams. If you already have the job, you are very difficult to beat. In the 20th century, for example, I think only a grand total of 5 presidents who were incumbents lost when they ran for reelection. And of those 5, 3 of them were vice presidents who either got the job because their boss died in office, or they were a vice president who replaced, okay, a popular president who finished a second term. Of the guys who were elected on their own, somebody like John Quincy Adams, only 2 of them were defeated in the 20th century. One was a guy named Herbert Hoover. The other was a guy named Jimmy Carter. When Herbert Hoover was president, the Great Depression was going on. By the time he ran for re-election, 30% of the country was out of work. When Jimmy Carter ran for re-election, if prices in America were going up 10% a year, there was a recession, 10% of the country was out of work. And so it takes a lot to cost a guy who already has the job an election. When the 1828 elections were going on, the country was actually coming out of the depression of the Panic of 1819. The last year of unemployment was 1825. By 1828, the economy is going really well. So Andrew Jackson has to run against a guy who's already in office at a time when the economy is going well. This is how the election turned out. Andrew Jackson won all these states here in yellow. Uh, Quincy Adams only won the states here in red. That is, not only did Andrew Jackson beat him, Andrew Jackson beat him overwhelmingly. This shows you the awesome power of the political system that Martin Van Buren and Jackson are building. That is by using the spoils system, by having Seinfeld elections, elections about nothing. They can mobilize large numbers of people and get them to vote. And they can use that in order to take control of the government. Right? And they can use all those tools involved in to do that. They can use charismatic individuals. They can use the spectacle of the party, the feeling of belonging, of being part of it. They could use the spoils system. And there's another tool they could use as well to motivate people to get involved without actually having to deal with any real issues. And that's by dealing with fake issues. This was innovated in America by this man here. His name is Thurlow Weed. And Thurlow Weed was a newspaper editor from New York State. He wanted to get involved in politics, but Martin Van Buren didn't like him, so he didn't have a way in. So he got a job as a newspaper editor instead. And he was looking for his way to get into politics, right? And he found his opening in 1825. It involved a group called the Freemasons. The Freemasons were a political organization created in the 1780s in Europe. In Europe, the Freemasons were a secret society. That is, they organized for democratic reforms in countries where the king didn't want to have anybody telling them they were wrong. The Freemasons, by the time you get into the late 1700s, was actually a pretty big organization. A lot of leaders of the new United States were members of the organization. George Washington, for example, was a Freemason. If you've ever seen a dollar bill, the Great Seal of the United States on the back of the dollar bill, the pyramid with the eyeball over it, is a Masonic symbol. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., there are all kinds of Masonic symbols built into the architecture. Right? And as a result of this, a lot of conspiracy theories developed about the Masons. That is, there's this idea that the Masons have all kinds of political power, particularly because they operated in secret. If they operate in secret, who knows who a Mason is and who knows where they are. By the time you get to the 1820s, though, the Masons really weren't a political organization anymore. The Masons were more a civic society. That is, in America, remember, you had a lot of rootless people. So, in order to get to know each other, in order to kind of get connections, you would see in new towns people creating fraternal organizations with names like the Kiwanis or the Lions Club or the Knights of Columbus. They're a bunch of businessmen would get together, they would eat bad meals and get drunk. Today, that kind of thing really isn't around anymore. You only really see them in kind of the far country. That is, you go places like Missouri, if you go into the deep country, you still see Masonic lodges in the small towns. You also see Masons basically in two other places today. You see them on black colleges. A lot of black fraternity guys, for some reason, are into the Masons. I'm not really sure why, but I saw that when I was at Prairie View. And the military. In the military, there are a lot of Masonic societies. Basically, uh, for if you're an enlisted man in the military, life is one long episode of Jackass. That is, you got nothing to do most of the time, so it's easy to spend your time with liquor, with drugs, and to do things like drop M80s into toilets to blow them up. So, however, a lot of other people instead join the Masons, and the Masons do things like or self-help group in the military. They run Bible studies. They okay, do like educational things, so on and so forth. So the Masons in the 18th, 19th century were just basically a civic society where a bunch of people got together and hung out. But they kept the secrecy that was around in the 18 and the 1700s. They didn't need it to protect themselves politically. They just kept it because it looked cool. Right? So if you ever know anybody who was a Mason, they got all kinds of secret symbols, secret handshakes. You're not supposed to tell anybody about the Masons, so on and so forth. So there was always this kind of climate of suspicion about them because they operated in secrecy and they had this old tie to politics. And American politics is society in general is inherently paranoid. We saw that when we looked at the American Revolution. There's all kinds of ideas out there that there are secret conspiracies out there to destroy America. After the revolution, actually, these kind of sense of paranoia became even more intense because now America was the world's only democracy. And they figured that all the kings in the world would be conspiring to destroy it. Okay? So fast forward to 1824. In upstate New York, in the town where Thurlow Weed lived, I don't remember what town it was, there was a con man. This con man joined his local chapter of the Masons so he could write a book talking about all their secrets, their secret handshakes, their secret ranks, how they secretly ran the world. However, right when his book was about to come out, he mysteriously disappeared. His family went to the police to get them to investigate. The police couldn't do anything. Anybody want to guess what the chief of police was? He was a Mason. So they went to the city council. They wanted to get the city council to get the police to do something. The city council wouldn't do anything either. What were all the members of the city council also members of? The Masons. So this con man's family went knocking on doors. They wouldn't get anybody to listen to them. Finally, they went to their friendly neighborhood newspaper editor, Thurlow Weed. Thurlow Weed saw this story and he saw an opportunity. And much like the great running back, he ran to daylight. What was the opportunity? Well, he knew that the people around him were a bunch of paranoid conspiracy kooks. And he knew that people didn't trust the Masons. So he went around and used his newspaper to really sensationalize the story. Every day there was a headline about how this con man wasn't really a con man. He was a hero who was murdered. And he would run editorials about who murdered him. That is, he said that all this was the work of the Masons. He called the Masons a monster institution. A monster institution is a group that operates in secrecy. Its ultimate goal is to monopolize the wealth and power of the nation and to turn everybody else into slaves. Since it's operating in secret, nobody knows that it's there. It uses bribery and corruption to infiltrate the people's government. It's like a cancer. It's taking over cell after cell until one day it will gain enough power within the government that it could dispense with the illusion, just become a dictatorship, turn everybody else into slaves, and destroy the people. Right? So Weed said that is what the Masons were, and the death of this guy in New York was evidence of it. So what he said was the only way to beat this conspiracy, to beat this monster institution, was to unite behind a hero who would bring the conspiracy out to the light of day and crush it. That hero's name was Thurlow Weed. So he created a political party called the Anti-Mason Party in order to stop this conspiracy of Masons from destroying democracy and destroying America. There was no conspiracy of Masons to destroy democracy and destroy America. The only thing they wanted to do was meet and get drunk. So how well can a political party do whose sole issue is to fight against a bogus conspiracy? Well, by 1830, the Anti-Mason Party was the second largest political party in the United States, behind only the Masons, right? Which shows you the power of positive paranoia. That is, if you could unite people behind fake issues, you can mobilize them in order to be able to come out there and get involved, right? Especially you can mobilize them in a way where you really don't alienate anybody, because the Masons themselves were a small organization. If the Masons hate you, so what? Okay, the other 99% of the public, as long as they're going along with you, are more than enough to win. Right? So this idea of fighting the monster institution, of using paranoia as a mobilizing force, is highly powerful. And the political parties in the second party system used it. The people who used it best were the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party had the best politicians. However, they could not mobilize the public against the Masons because Andrew Jackson was a Mason. If any of you are into anti-Mason conspiracies on the interwebs, that's one of the things they point out. There were something like 13 presidents who were Masons. Andrew Jackson was one of them. Instead, the Democrats looked for another fake enemy of America, another monster institution that they could be paranoid against. They picked the banks. Particularly, they picked one bank, the Bank of the United States. Okay? The Bank of the United States was created in 1796 as a result of the financial plan of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton wanted this bank in order to regulate the currency in America. He modeled it on the Bank of England in the UK. That is, the Bank of the United States is a privately owned bank if it be owned by shareholders. However, the US government would deposit its tax money into it and keep the money there until they needed to spend the money in order to pay their bills. So the bank would have a huge pool of capital, and the bank could then use that money in order to develop industry. So if you were Alexander Hamilton, the bank would help you develop what you wanted to develop, which was industry, and would also make sure that other banks stayed in line because it was the biggest bank in the country. Right? Fast forward to 1816. Hamilton was gone, and James Madison was president. James Madison was one of Thomas Jefferson's allies. Okay, in the first party system, the other political party from the one that Hamilton was a part of. When the Bank of the United States was created in 1796, Congress only gave it a 20-year charter. So if it wanted to continue to exist, it would have to go back to Congress and get another charter in 1816. Right? Jefferson's party controlled Congress at that time. They passed a new charter for the bank, and Jefferson's ally, James Madison, signed it. So this new charter would go on for another 20 years. Okay? Fast forward to 1832. Henry Clay decides he wants to run for president again. Right? By the way, he's going to do it one more time, too. He ran for president 3 times. Spoiler alert, he didn't win. Anyway, 1832, he wants to run for president again. So he needs an issue that he could use in order to run against Andrew Jackson. He decided the issue he wanted to run on was the Bank of the United States. Right? Because Andrew Jackson was an idiot. He didn't understand banks. He particularly didn't understand the Bank of the United States. Right? So basically, Clay figured he could put Andrew Jackson in an impossible position. Right? What his thinking went like this. He went to Nicholas Biddle, who was the chairman of the Bank of the United States. He's the guy pictured here in the cartoon. And he told Nicholas Biddle to ask for his charter early in 1832. Clay wanted this because he figured he had the votes in Congress to get the charter passed. Right? And as a result, he would put Andrew Jackson in an impossible position because Jackson would only have 2 choices. Choice number one is he could try to oppose the charter, in which case he would lose. And Henry Clay could go to the country and say, this is who the real alpha dog is. Andrew Jackson talks a lot about being the hero, the common man, but I'm the person who really gets things done. Jackson's other option was he could decide not to oppose the charter of the bank, in which case Clay could go to the country and say, Jackson calls himself a hero, but really is a coward. Everybody knew he was against this bank, but he saw me, a real man, pushing the bank, and he knew better than to get in my way. So basically, Henry Clay figured either way Andrew Jackson went with the bank, Andrew Jackson was going to come out losing. Right? So Biddle did what he was told. He asked Congress for its charter early. Congress, as Henry Clay expected, passed the charter. It then went to the president to sign. And this is where Andrew Jackson outsmarted him. Aided by Martin Van Buren, pictured right over here. How did he outsmart him? Well, Andrew Jackson vetoed the charter. At this time, a veto was something that was rarely done. That is, the Constitution says that when Congress signs a law, the president then will have to sign it too. If he doesn't sign it, it is what is called vetoed. That is, the law doesn't take effect. However, for up between 1789 and 1832, presidents rarely used the veto. That is, they thought that Congress should be the leading role in America, and that you should only veto a law that Congress passes if it violates the Constitution. You couldn't seriously argue that the Bank of the United States violated the Constitution. Why not? Because Alexander Hamilton, the guy who created the Bank of the United States, was one of the principal writers of the Constitution. James Madison was the other principal writer of the Constitution. As president in 1816, he re-signed the charter. He signed the charter when it came up for renewal. A majority of the 55 men who wrote the Constitution voted for the Bank of the United States either in 1719 or 1816. So you couldn't really make a plausible argument that the Bank of the United States violated the US Constitution. So how could Andrew Jackson justify vetoing his charter, putting himself before Congress? Well, he explained it in his veto message. In the message, he said that the Bank of the United States was a monster institution. That is, it was owned by a group of shareholders who operated in secret. Their ultimate goal was to monopolize the wealth and power of the United States and turn all the other people into slaves. Since they were secret, nobody knew that they were there. They used bribery and corruption to work their way through the people's government. They were kind of moving like a cancer. And if they weren't stopped, they would ultimately destroy the country and reduce everyone into slaves. And the only way to stop them was to unite behind a hero who would bring the conspiracy out into the light of day and crush it. That hero's name was Andrew Jackson. That was basically what he did. Was he took exactly the same story that Thurlow Weed told about the Masons, crossed out Mason, and wrote in Bank of the United States. That's the beautiful thing about these conspiracy theories. They're basically like Mad Libs. If any of you ever played with Mad Libs when you were, say, in elementary school or junior high, these are these things where you get a sheet that tells you to name an adjective, name a noun, name a name, name a color, stuff like that. And then you pull up the sheet of paper, and then you see it all fits into a wacky story. Conspiracies work the same way. You could cross out Mason and write in bank. You could cross out bank, write in Jew. And you could use exactly the same narrative over and over again. Right? So Andrew Jackson is using a bogus story about the Bank of the United States to get people mobilized. How well did it work? He won even bigger in 1832 than he did in 1828. Right? So what you get by 1832 is a political system that is at its height. It now has multiple tools that it can use to get people motivated to go out and vote, to be engaged in politics, without having to deal with any of the underlying issues in the country. Right? And the Democratic Party dominates the country. However, there were a lot of politicians who were on the outside looking in. These were politicians who, for one reason or another, didn't make it in the Democratic Party. That is, the leadership of the Democratic Party didn't like him. People like Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Thurlow Weed. If those guys wanted to stay in politics, they had to figure out a way to fight the Democratic Party. How they did that was by creating their own party. They called it the Whig Party. The Whig Party would be running candidates for election by 1836. So if you are one of those politicians and you are to run against the Democratic Party, then what could you do? Well, the Democratic Party is avoiding all the major issues in the country. So one way to run against them is to take a stand on all those issues, thereby showing the country you're serious, the Democrats are not. The politicians, the Whig Party, very quickly decided that that was a stupid idea. Right? That the only thing you did by taking stands on issues was enemies. And the safest number of issues to take a stand on was none. So if they weren't going to take a stand on any issues, then how could they get people elected to office? Well, they could find charismatic leaders and run them. So you could vote for the person and not for okay, the issue. They would hold big spectacles, okay, to get large numbers of people involved. That way that they could root for the Whig Party like it was a team. They could use the spoils system. Okay? That is, that they could promise organizers jobs. They could promise services to people in order to vote. They could use the sale of government contracts in order to pay for it all. And they could unite behind paranoid conspiracies. In this case, their paranoid conspiracies ran against the Democratic Party, because they said the Democratic Party was a monster institution. It used bribery and corruption in order to undermine the people's government, as you could see by their expensive use of the spoils system. And if it wasn't stopped, it would wind up destroying America and reduce everyone into slavery. That's actually where the Whig Party got their name, from this conspiracy story. The Whig Party, the word Whig came from English political history. In the 1700s, Whigs were opponents of the king in England. So the Whig Party said that they were going to save the country from the tyranny of King Andrew Jackson. Right? That is, the Whigs were going to use everything the Democrats used. They were going to be a mirror image of them. The only difference was going to be their voters. Right? And this actually is something that you can still see today. That is, if you know any political geeks, no matter what party they believe in, they will go on and on and on and on and on about how they believe in their party because of the issues. It's not actually true. They believe in whatever issues they believe in because of the party. Why did they root for that particular party? For the same reason you became a Whig or a Democrat in 1836. That is, the membership of your political party was a result of what ethnicity and what culture you were a part of. Right? Let me explain why. Say you are the Democratic Party and you want to organize Pennsylvania. Right? And say the first organizers who organized the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania were farmers from the countryside, Scots-Irish people. They, and say there are enough Scots-Irish people for you to organize, that you control 51% of Pennsylvania. So if you go out and hold a state election, you will win. Scots-Irish aren't the only people in Pennsylvania. If you go into Philadelphia, there are Quakers in the city. But if you're the Democratic Party and you already organized all the Scots-Irish people, you already have a majority of the population, then why bother go in and organize the Quakers? That just is more government jobs you get a handout, right? More expenses for the party that have to be paid for, more rallies to hold, so on and so forth. So when the Democrats went in first and they organized groups in the states, they left out a lot of significant ethnic and cultural groups. For example, the Democrats in the southern states organized the small farmers, which meant that the large slave owners were basically on the outside looking in. In places like Pennsylvania, they organized the Scots-Irish, which meant that the Quakers of the cities were on the outside looking in. In Massachusetts, they organized the Irish Catholics, which meant that the Yankees out in the countryside were on the outside looking in. So what the Whig Party did was they went in and organized all those people that the Democrats didn't. If the Democrats organized the Scots-Irish of Pennsylvania, they would organize the Quakers. If the Democrats organized the Irish Catholics of Boston, they would organize the Yankees of the countryside. Right? So basically, what you got in the two political parties were ethnocultural coalitions, coalitions of ethnicities and religious groups that were tied together into political parties that basically avoided issues. And essentially, that's the same reason why people vote for political parties today. That is, the politicians and voters can talk till they're blue in the face about how they are principled and all that. But if you look at the results of the 2016 elections in Houston, Texas, who you voted for largely depended on your race. Right? That is I believe Trump got somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% of the white vote in Houston. Clinton got somewhere around 75% of the Hispanic vote. Clinton got 90% of the black vote. And you go around the country, you see the same thing. So what you're seeing set up in 1836 is going to have a long-term significance. And you have two political parties by the 1830s that are organizing ethnic and cultural groups into large political parties that are avoiding all the underlying issues of the country. And they're tying their groups together by using things like charismatic individuals to motivate them, by emphasizing their sense of belonging by holding those big pep rallies, giving the party itself as something that you could feel like you belong to, that you can identify with, that by using the spoils system, by running paranoid conspiracies about the other side, right? And out of these two political parties, the Democrats were bigger because they went first, they got the best politicians, and they organized the biggest groups. So you're the Whig Party, you were perennially uh, Pepsi to the Democrats' Coke, right? You were Burger King to their McDonald's. You wanted to figure out a way to finally get in there and win. They got their chance in the elections of 1840 because right after the elections of 1836, another big economic depression broke out. This is called the Panic of 1837. In a lot of ways, the Panic of 1837 was even bigger than the Panic of 1819 because the United States was more of a market economy in 1837. In the big cities of America, you had 20% of the population out of work. And the underlying cause of the Panic of 1837 was in England, they started to cut back on credit, and that winds up generating a system of bank failures, much like you saw when the Bank of the United States did it in 1819. And so the next thing you know, thousands of people are out of work. After 1819, they thought they would use the Bank of the United States in order to prevent a systematic financial crisis like that. However, Andrew Jackson just destroyed the Bank of the United States, so it's not there anymore in order to save the banks. So by the time you get to the summer of 1837, millions of people are out of work and people are angry and scared. Andrew Jackson doesn't have to worry about that, though, because his second term of office expired in 1836, and he did not run for reelection. That is, there was a tradition that presidents would only serve 2 terms. He honored the tradition. So all of the blame for the panic went to his successor, a guy named Martin Van Buren, which is Van Buren's plan worked. He figured he could suck up to Andrew Jackson, get Andrew Jackson elected president, and Andrew Jackson would pull him the rest of the way to the top. That's actually what happened. When Jackson offended his second term, he used his influence in the party to make sure that Martin Van Buren got the nomination after him. Martin Van Buren won the presidential elections of 1836, which meant he was president while the Panic of 1837 went on and created an economic depression. Right? Since he wasn't charismatic, the public had no trouble blaming him for the depression. Right? So if you're the Whig Party, you figure if you can't beat Martin Van Buren when he's running for re-election in 1840, you might as well disband the party because you just can't win. Right? So, in the elections of 1840, you see kind of the high point of the second party system, where you have two political parties that are both strong and that have a chance to win. The Whig Party in that election nominated for president this man here. His name is William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison became publicly known during the War of 1812. He commanded a regiment of Illinois militia, Indiana militia, sorry, to fight Native Americans who were allied with the British. He defeated Native Americans led by a Shawnee war chief named Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and he became a national hero as a result. He got a reputation of himself as being a man's man because since he was a military general, he was somebody who went out and got things done. Note if that sounds familiar. Basically, the Whigs, a party that was created to oppose Andrew Jackson, right, that said that Andrew Jackson was a plot to destroy America, found their own Andrew Jackson, as they were going to put out there a charismatic individual. They then hired the best advertising agency in New York to sell him to America. They did this by coming up with a bunch of catchy slogans, such as Tippecanoe and Tyler too, where Tippecanoe was the battle he won, John Tyler was his vice presidential candidate. Right? And they avoided all the underlying issues of the country. The election that followed very quickly became basically an exercise in name calling, where Harrison's allies would go over and insult Martin Van Buren. They said that Van Buren was an elitist who spent all his time in the White House getting drunk on French wine and running around with English whores. Why English whores? Because he was too good for American whores. The Democrats countered by saying that William Henry Harrison over here was an idiot. All he did all day was go onto the front porch of his log cabin, sit in his rocking chair, and get drunk drinking hard cider. That insult turned out to be the strategic error of the election, because that description fit 70% of the United States in 1840. The Whigs picked up the ball and ran with it. Right? William Henry Harrison was really a millionaire. He lived in a mansion. But the Whig Party built in the front yard of his mansion a log cabin. They then invited reporters from throughout the United States to come by and see William Henry Harrison at his house. They were brought to his log cabin where he was sitting on the front porch in a rocking chair with a jug of hard cider in his lap. He then answered no questions, and the reporters went back and printed that in their newspapers. The Whigs then made the log cabin the centerpiece of their campaign. And you can still see, if you go on eBay, a lot of log cabin swag from that election. That is, you had log cabin flyers, right? Log cabin flags, right? Log cabin jewelry. This is my personal favorite. This is one of those things where if you push in a stick, you get a picture, and if you pull it out, you get a different picture. If you push it in, you get a beautiful goblet of White House champagne. And Martin Van Buren is all smiley. If you pull it out, you get log cabin hard cider, and he's all frowny because he's too good for that kind of thing. That's basically you had the ultimate election about nothing. An election where all the underlying issues that were involved in that depression were being ignored, and you are getting an election instead about personalities. How did it turn out? Well, William Henry Harrison won. He won all these states here in rows, okay, whereas Van Buren won the states in green. So William Henry Harrison becomes president. His problem was that he sold himself as a hero of the common man like Andrew Jackson, as a man's man, as somebody who went out and got things done. This was a problem because William Henry Harrison was the oldest man ever elected president. Right? So now he had to live up to the image. How he decided to do that was when he came to Washington for his inaugural. Rather than riding a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage from the Capitol to the White House after he was sworn in, he was going to march in his own parade. Right? On his inauguration day, Washington had the biggest blizzard in its history. He decided to walk in his parade anyway. And being a man's man, he decided he was going to walk in his parade without a coat or a scarf because coats and scarves were for sissies. Once he got to the White House, he went outside, stood outside the White House, and gave to his adoring public the longest inaugural address in the entire history of the United States. He spoke for over 2 hours. in the middle of a blizzard, not wearing a coat or a scarf because coats and scarves were for sissies. As he was done, he went into the White House, caught pneumonia, and died 40 days later. The end. So, what you got here is now the high point of the second party system. You have two political parties who are each identical to each other, mirror images of each other. The only difference is which groups of people are they trying to mobilize. Right? And they're mobilizing their people by avoiding all the underlying divisions of the country. Right? Is there anything bad you could possibly say about the system? Well, they are avoiding all the underlying issues of the country. And they are taking the Babu rule of problems. As the Babu principle of problems is, if I got 10 problems, I figure if I ignore them long enough, 9 of them will go away on their own. This is true. However, that 10th problem will really kick you in the ass. So they are letting deep underlying problems fester. They're not dealing with them, and if one of them gets out of control, it could run through the country like a cancer. Also, remember how this political system is organizing itself. It is using the spoils system. Essentially, it is inherently corrupt and ineffective. That is, you are now at Tomball going to a public institution. Imagine if every teacher you had at Tomball got his job because he sucked up to the right politician, or her job because she sucked up to the right politician. What do you think the quality of your education would be like? That was the state of America. Every bridge you rode over was designed by an engineer who got the contract not because that engineer was particularly competent. That engineer got the contract because he supported the right politician or he paid a bribe to the right politician. Right? You have essentially government contracts given out on the basis of bribes. So the system is going to create an American government that isn't going to deal with underlying issues and that is going to be inherently corrupt and inefficient. But the system also had a number of strengths. And let's take a look at what they are. For one thing, look at this map over here. Look at where William Henry Harrison won. William Henry Harrison won in the North. He won in the South, meaning he won in the free states and he won in the slave states. He won in the East, he won in the West. He won in the cities, he won on the farms. Right? He won among bankers, he won among debtors. And then you look at Martin Van Buren in the same election, the guy who lost. Where did he win? He won in the free states, he won in the slave states. He won in the East, he won in the West. He won in the cities, he won in the country. He won among bankers, he won among debtors. Right? That is, in a country where you have a lot of divisive issues that could threaten to tear the country apart, these political parties basically serve as a unifying force. They are holding a country together that could easily fly apart. A good analogy for this is last time I went to India, I had a suitcase that broke the day before I was supposed to get on a plane, so I didn't have time to get a new one. That is, I was in India at the time, the hinge on the suitcase broke. So, in order to be able to get back, my uncle got this length of twine, circled it around the suitcase, and tied a knot to hold the whole thing together. It was totally ghetto, but it worked. It held my suitcase together till I got home. Essentially, the two political parties are in a divided country the length of twine. As long as those political parties could keep doing their act, they could keep a divided country from flying apart. That is not a achievement that should be taken for granted. That is something that was doing the country a great service. Also, you can see another benefit of this political parties, and that is you can see that by looking at the elections. Look at how many people voted in 1824. Compare that to 1828, 1832, 1940, Note that the number of voters is going up. That is, this system, for all its flaws, was very good at getting common people involved in government, common people involved in politics. Average people cared about these elections. In the 2016 presidential elections, less than half of the people who were eligible to vote voted in that election. Right? The 2008 presidential election was the one that in recent years generated the most interest. It had charismatic guys running who had were attracted a lot of public attention. It got 60% of the eligible voters in the United States to turn out to vote. The 1840 election turned out 90% of the eligible voters in the United States. Throughout the 19th century, presidential elections routinely got 80 to 90% of the people to turn out and vote. Off year elections routinely got about 60% of the people to turn out to vote. So these political parties in the second party system did do a pretty significant achievement. They held a divided country together and they got millions of people motivated to take part in public affairs. However, it did so at a high price. You got a government that's getting increasingly corrupt, increasingly ineffective, and isn't dealing with underlying problems, is letting them fester. And sooner or later, one of these problems is going to get out of control. And the problem that did is going to be slavery. Slavery is going to get to a point where it is just going to keep growing and growing and growing. It's going to be an abscess that is never boiled, right? That is never lanced. And if anything ever happens to these political parties, that underlying divisive issue is going to overwhelm the entire country. And what we're going to see in a future class is in the 1850s, these two political parties were severely weakened. The Whig Party disappeared, the Democratic Party became much less powerful. And when the parties were weakened, when the second party system doesn't exist anymore, the undealt with issue slavery runs amok. And it is going to overwhelm the political system and lead to the Civil War. So we will deal with that in a future class. But for now, let me stop here on this subject, and I will come back with another recording shortly.